Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is 4 p.m. Geneva time. My name is Teresa Horeisova, and I'm welcoming you from the Geneva Internet Platform and Diplo from our Conf Lab in Geneva. I have a very special guest with me today. It's Professor Rolf Weber, who has written a book entitled Internet Governance at the Point of No Return. And today's discussion will be dedicated to some of the conclusions and topics that Professor Weber has worked on. I will not go into details introducing Professor Rolf Weber. You can see his profile online, but also in the description of this event that my colleagues can share in the chat. But the most important fact to get us started, that Rolf is a law professor at the University of Zurich here in Switzerland. He has been really involved in many digital policy processes, both in Switzerland and globally, and contributed quite actively and significantly to the academic discourse on internet governance. Besides Rolf here with us at the studio, we also have several colleagues who are supporting this event behind the scenes. And the bridge between us and you will be our colleague Katharina Höhne, who is Diplo's Director for Research. And I would like to quickly hand over to Katharina now for a minute. Katharina.
Thank you, Teresa. It's a pleasure to be here. So yeah, we're really looking for your questions and your comments, which I will feed back into the discussion back to the Geneva office. But before we start, we would also like to know a little bit more about you, actually. So we have a very quick poll on basically on your background, and we're asking, your profile is, are you from academia, from the government, civil society, tech community, the private sector, or other? So we're going to give you just a few seconds to give us an idea, so we know who we're talking to, basically. Okay, about 50% have voted. Last chance. Okay, I think let's stop here. And we actually have 40% from governments, followed by 20% from civil society, academia 10%, and then private sector and other is actually also 20%. So I'm going to be curious to see who's behind other. So your comments and questions we're looking forward to. But now back to Teresa to get into the discussion on this wonderful book.
Thank you very much, Katharina. So good to hear that actually 40% of our attendees are from governments and from the policy side, which will be very, very interesting. So once again, Professor Weber, welcome.
Thank you for the invitation.
You're very welcome. And my first question about the book that, as I said, you can download for free online is the following. Why did you actually decide to write this book? Was there any gap that you were trying to address, something that was missing in the discussion?
Well, thank you very much for this quite difficult question, but I tried to answer twofold. First of all, when I decided to write a book and also to publish it open access so that everybody can download it, at that time, I had the feeling that we are at a critical phase on the way to the Internet Governance Forum 2025, the so-called IGF Plus, because in 4 years' time, the 10 years period will elapse, and we can expect that UN authorities and other governmental bodies, of course, also private businesses, are interested to find a new form for the IGF. And I thought, well, from the academic side, it would be worthwhile to look for possible designs of the regulatory framework for cyberspace. Then the other question of the gap. Of course, as an academic person, I always try to find gaps, but in this respect, I have the impression that on the one hand, we lack a little bit, and still lack interdisciplinary work in the field of internet governance. And on the other hand, we have to see that we can combine the ongoing work on internet governance with the UN roadmap on digital cooperation. So we need to build bridges. We have to embed this UN initiative into the discussions of the IGF. Mm-hmm. And on the top of that, and this is due to my parallel work on issues of international law, I had the feeling that a couple of international legal concepts are available, but not yet made fruitful for internet governance discussions. First of all, the duty of cooperation contained in many UN documents, starting with the UN Charter. Duty of cooperation is often referred to in the context of sustainable development. In this context, it is of course important, but I think that it also plays a role in internet governance. Then the concept of global public goods, which encompasses the undertaking to use common resources in a respectful manner. I particularly believe in the concept of shared spaces. We do see this concept, for example, in the Outer Space Treaty and in the conventions on the high sea. It is, of course, designed to make equitable use of the common resources and limit sovereignty of nation states as far as outer space or high sea is concerned. And somehow a similar situation is given in the context of internet governance. And finally, more from the trade and supply chain angle, we see the principle of due diligence more frequently mentioned in international documents, for example, in the OECD. And due diligence means respectful use of the resources. So if we combine all the four concepts which I mentioned and try to make them fruitful for internet governance, I think that we can come a step ahead. And in the background, we do have responsibility provisions in UN law. If somebody does not comply with international concepts, risk of responsibility occurs, known from environmental law, but equally applicable in internet governance.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, especially for bringing all of these interdisciplinary dimensions in this. One thing that certainly caught my attention in your book was when you're bringing up the concept of the social contract, yes, and how the society can function, linking it to internet governance. Can you tell us more about that notion?
I can try to say a little bit more about the theory of the social contract, but it will be very theoretical, so I'm going to try to be quite short on that. Social contract theory goes back to Socrates and has then been taken up by Thomas Hobbes in the famous book called Leviathan. Hobbes pleaded for the formation of the Commonwealth being a rudimentary form of social contract. John Locke, an other philosopher, has referred to natural law as part of the social contract, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau, again, a Swiss person, again, a person from Geneva, has mainly developed the social contract theory. And as I said, I rather prefer not to go too deeply now into this theory, but I'm glad to answer questions if afterwards somebody would like to know more. The important point why I have tried to refer to this old concept has to be seen in the fact that, in my appreciation, social contract theory has been revitalized in the internet community. It started with John Perry Barlow's declaration on the independence of cyberspace, has then been taken up, slightly different, by Lawrence Lessig with his concept of the commons of knowledge. He even used the German notion of Allmend being a medieval collective pasture land. And later, we can argue with social contract theory if we try to find a foundation for multi-stakeholderism. And multi-stakeholderism is, of course, a key element in the whole internet governance context. Again, I would assume that most of the attendees are familiar with the multi-stakeholder concept. I'm glad to come back to further details, but I strongly believe in this concept, and therefore somehow I tried to give an academic foundation by referring to social context theory.
No, and thank you for that. I did have to ask this question because this is a topic that Diplo has been quite curious about for some time, especially our director, Jovan Kurbalia, has also been looking into that. So it couldn't escape my attention. Now, let's get back to the more legal elements of your book. Now, you have built your book around the legal principles that are especially relevant in the internet governance context. The principles of legitimacy, participation, transparency, and accountability. Now, why this structure? Why these instruments?
As a law professor, I'm more or less obliged to look for a legal foundation. So the starting point of my academic approach has, in fact, been the framework, the legal framework, or the normative framework. And I have done so by trying to build two pillars. The first pillar concerns the regulatory theories. And I have looked through all the different approaches over the last 20 years. This part is, of course, mainly for the academics. If I address, for example, Lex Informatica, code regulation, polycentric regulation, etc., this is a basis for academic discussions. And the second pillar concerns those four elements which I have identified as being particularly important for internet governance, and you already mentioned the four elements. First, legitimacy is important for all legislative activities. Participation, here I deeply look into the multi-stakeholder approach as an important element of the decision-making processes. And then transparency and accountability have been the main discussion issues, at least in connection with ICANN as the private regulator of names and numbers. And if I look back over the last 10 years, we do have 4 reports of the so-called accountability and transparency review team of ICANN. The acronym is ATRT. The reports became longer and longer. The 4th report of last year exceeds already 300 pages. And having such volume of written documents, a law professor cannot come around of addressing them. But my conclusion is now, if I look at ICANN, but also at International Telecommunications Union and the IGF, in principle, we are much more advanced in transparency and accountability. So we have better results in these fields than in legitimacy and particularly in participation. So I would recommend for the IGF Plus and 2025 that we look more deeply into participation issues. And if we do so, then we also increase the chance that we can solve the participation issues. And on the top of that, I have also tried to make fruitful a few newer theoretical approaches developed in international public law. One aspect is called transnationalism. we need more and more harmonized rules being equally applicable around the globe. And the other concept is the so-called cosmopolitanism. I stop here because, again, I'm coming into theories, but I'm glad to answer questions to these more theoretical aspects.
No, thank you very much for that. And if our time allows, I would like to then later come back to the IGF a little bit more in particular. Now, one part of your book is dedicated to the issue of standardization. The question of digital standards is a very delicate one. It's also very relevant in these days in the Geneva context because of some discussions and negotiations happening there. So a whole chapter of your book is actually dedicated to that. The chapter is entitled Technological Developments and Standardization. I can also imagine that this chapter would give quite some good context and a kind of zoomed out view on the issue that they have to deal with in the policy context. But could you maybe tell us more, and let's stop at this delicate and controversial topic for a little while?
Yeah, I mean, standardization is of course a delicate issue, but I would say it's not at all a new issue. We do have the standardization problem since we use telecommunications networks. And the reason for having established the International Telecommunications Union in 1865, as in fact the second oldest multilateral organization with domicile in Geneva, is exactly the reason that the countries at that time, more than 150 years ago, realized that not each country can implement national standards, that cross-border communication requires harmonization of standardization. And this, of course, continues and is important now, as it has been important 150 years ago. Therefore, we also see some pressure on the ITU somehow to adapt, to adjust the existing regulations for telecommunications, as the respective conference in Dubai in 2012, the WIGIT has shown it's not so easy as one could think, because if we talk about security of standardization in telecommunications, we are confronted with two different security notions. We have, let's say, the pure technical security, robust network, etc. And we also have a more politically driven standardization. To what extent are nation states allowed to implement specific standards in order to protect their sovereign needs, social policy, etc. And here, and I vaguely felt somehow your reference to International Geneva. Here, Geneva indeed comes into play again. I mentioned ITU has always been and still is in Geneva, but also private initiatives, for example, the initiative of Microsoft in the context of cyber security, specifically referred to Geneva. The Microsoft Convention has been called the Digital Geneva Convention, notwithstanding the fact that Microsoft is not really a Geneva enterprise. It has not been very successful for the time being. It does not fly, I would say, but we have other important Geneva initiatives, in particular the Geneva Dialogue on Responsible Behavior in Cyberspace. And obviously, I have to mention here that this dialogue is substantially driven by Switzerland and by the Prof Foundation. Again, Geneva plays a crucial role here. Geneva is the forum hub for the respective discussions, and lately, and by the way, not surprisingly, the report of the open-ended working group on cybersecurity issues and the respective guidelines have been published and announced here in Geneva under Swiss Ambassador Jürg Lauber. So we do have an additional Geneva link here. Of course, to be fair, also as a Swiss, I have to say that as far as Internet protocol issues are concerned, the main work is done by the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is not situated in domicile, but I would like to mention this task force because it's almost an ideal model of multi-stakeholderism. Everybody can participate, everybody's voice is heard in the IETF, and the IETF is presenting standards usually after a global call, a call for giving input to draft standards, and somehow the multi-stakeholder approach chosen by IETF could also be made fruitful in the whole internet governance context. And finally, if we talk about standards and about somehow the delicate part of the issue, I cannot avoid of referring to fragmentation. We are at risk at this time to fragment the global infrastructure because some sovereign states all of a sudden try to implement censorship at the border, maybe in the meaning of political security, as I mentioned before, not on technical security. But if somehow this development is going on, and if more and more countries would try to implement national standards, we would really step back in our whole development of a global infrastructure. And if I hear that ICANN board is somehow considering to distinguish between the technical internet governance and the political social internet governance, then I see the point. ICANN wants to save the technical global standardization, but in my opinion, it's a step into a wrong direction to split between two different kinds of internet governance.
Oh, thank you. That's an excellent answer, and I'm really glad that you stayed at International Geneva for such a long time. Actually, a significant part of our audience today is based in Geneva. Maybe our diplomats posted at permanent missions. So for them, I'm sure that this was particularly useful. I will also misuse this opportunity if you allow me to share with our audience that we have mapped all the Geneva-based actors that have some relevance to internet governance in our Geneva Digital Atlas that we launched a few months ago, and that is kind of a living resource on what is happening in Geneva that globally has relevance for internet governance and digital policy. And maybe I will ask my colleague Katarina to share the link in the chat. Now, at the very beginning of our session, we asked about the stakeholder group that our audience is coming from, and we learned that 40% come actually from governments, while at the same time, this is an academic resource. Yes, it's a very valid and proper academic work that you have done. Why should government representatives, policy folks read your book?
Well,
and let's presume they should. Yeah, so tell us why.
Well, I do not want to start any marketing action for myself or for my person, but of course, I'm a law professor, and therefore I have to start with the legal environment and with the legal framework. But I tried hard to build the bridges to other disciplines, because as I said at the beginning, I had the feeling we lack a little bit interdisciplinary efforts. And if you look at the table of contents, again, you will find a chapter with the title Conversion of Theoretical Concepts into Policy and Policies and Rule Making. So I have really tried to bring in, to the best of my knowledge, the policy perspective. I have addressed political theories in this context. I have tried to provide guidance as to what principles should be adopted under the perspective of potential policies. And I have also intensively discussed the activities of the IGF, being of course a very important body in this whole field. And IGF is certainly not a legal body, not at least due to the fact that IGF cannot take any binding decision. What I also realized, and that's probably more a policy statement than a legal statement, at the time of the two World Summits on the Information Society, so 2003 and 2005, internet governance was often seen as a mainly technical issue with some political implications. Now the equation has reversed. It can be said that internet governance has become mainly a political issue with a technical component. And on this basis, it's unavoidable to discuss policies and to make also recommendations as far as policies is concerned. And a particular interest which I quickly mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, is the attempt to combine the internet governance elements with the UN activities on digital cooperation, namely the UN high-level panel on digital cooperation report of 2019 and the roadmap of the UN Secretary General of June 2020, so exactly now a year old, because I have the impression that somehow the two different tracks, or so far different tracks, have much in common. For example, if you look at the objective of an inclusive IGF and an inclusive digital society, these two elements are not far away from each other. Digital literacy plays a role in both fields. Maybe here we could also include UNESCO into the discussion. And insofar as I mentioned, I do see a good chance that we can come a step ahead by building a bridge between these activities. And perhaps I will now close before we go over to the questions of the audience by saying a word to my vision for the next 5 years, because by nature I'm an optimistic person. I believe that the IGF will remain in place, that the IGF will survive. I'm even so optimistic to believe that the IGF might gain additional functions in 2025. And my vision would be that internet governance should and could become a narrative for the conceptual design of policies and legal norms, again, combined, making cyberspace a livable and trustworthy place for civil society. And this vision, of course, includes now the more legal perception that in a multi-stakeholder concept, the participants should be enabled to make international law more visible.
Oh, thank you. That's an excellent vision. And also thank you for the hopeful words for the IGF. I just came out of 2 meetings of the IGF Open Consultation and MEC meeting. So that sounds very refreshing, and I will convey your vision that I can promise. Now, while I have kind of confiscated leading the discussion up until now, I would like to go over to Katarina, who has been monitoring the chat, because as I understood, there are things going on there. Katarina, over to you.
Thank you, Teresa. There are quite a number of things going on there. We have a very rich discussion, actually. Perhaps first, I'm going to focus on some very precise and specific questions that we got, and then if you have more time, I can reflect on some of the discussion, and then we can perhaps ask Professor Weber to also reflect on these points. But specific questions, we have 3. The first one goes kind of to the heart of the book. It comes from David McAuley, and so the book is titled, the subtitle is Point of No Return. And the question is that point of no return close, or has it perhaps already been passed? Second question is on the UN system. It comes from Geneva diplomat Johan Eckerholt. And he's asking, as the discussion on digital policy is picking up in the UN system, both due to increased role of digital in every part of society, as well as its increasing role in the economy, how would you see that the multi-stakeholder model could be better integrated into the UN system? And then the third question goes back to the topic of fragmentation of the internet. It comes from Richard Hill. And his question is about the US initiative called Clean Networks. And he wonders if this could result in a fragmentation of the internet. I'm going to stop here. Back to you, Teresa.
No, excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Katarina. So let's take these questions one by one. We have about 12 minutes to go in this event, and there will be more questions after that, right, Katarina?
Yes, I can reflect on the discussion, and there are a couple more points we can comment on, definitely.
Excellent. Just for our planning. So let's take the first question that came from David. Thank you, David, for that. And that is whether internet governance has already passed the point of no return or heading there.
Well, that's of course not an easy question, and I have to give a short answer. Possibly I would say yes. I said at the point of no return at the end of my short presentation before, I answered that I'm optimistic and that IGF will stay. And this possibly means that it has indeed passed the point of no return.
Well, that's not that optimistic, but thank you for that. Excellent. The second question came from Johan Eckerlund, who is a diplomat here at the Swedish Permanent Mission, and he asked about how to better integrate the multi-stakeholder model into the UN system.
Well, that's of course very difficult because the UN system, by its nature, is a system of nation states. And it can be hardly imagined that all of a sudden businesses or civil society can take part in discussions in UN bodies, at least not on a high level. But let me at least say that in the context of the International Telecommunications Union, we do have almost 800 participants not being governments, of course, not in a decision-making function, but at least input can be given. And I would then argue possibly UN bodies or traditional UN bodies should open somehow their floor to the parallel developments in IGF groups and IGF preparatory meetings, so that the respective ideas and thoughts can be exchanged.
Thank you for that. Just allow me a little sub-question to that. Do you feel that the kind of pandemic, online interactions in Geneva, or the probably to expect more hybrid interactions in Geneva can somehow influence what we can expect here in terms of the multi-stakeholder model?
Well, personally, I very much like physical meetings, but to be somehow honest, I really have the impression that the fact that we had to switch to online meetings increases the possibilities for many members of civil society to actively participate, particularly those members of civil society who cannot afford to travel long distances, etc. And insofar, I would add somehow the switch to online meetings and online exchanges also has some advantages.
Well, thank you for that. And the third question that Katarina brought up was from Richard Hale. Richard, thank you for your question, and it was on fragmentation and the clean networks. So any elaboration on this?
Well, I don't know whether Richard is allowed to ask me a question, but my answer is very short, in tendency, yes.
Thank you very much for that. So Katarina, I would like to go back to you because you promised that you would share more with us about the dynamism in the chat, more on the kind of comments rather than direct questions.
Well, in the meantime, we actually had more direct questions, so this is where I'm going to focus. I would like to share one comment first, which comes from Boris Engelson, and it's on standards. And then the questions we received are then also on standards. So first on standards, Boris supposes that what is new with the net are not standards per se, but the clash between two different logics: electronics on the one hand and semantics on the other hand. Operating the net is an engineer's issue. Finding the right information is a linguist's issue. So this was more of a comment, but I think perhaps also interesting for reflection. And then the questions on standards. There are two questions from Analia Dimova. And first is the question if Professor Weber could comment on the cooperation between China and Germany on standards, especially in terms of technical standardization. And then she asks, also a very technical question, what is next on polymorphic networks? What about the relationship between ITU and ETSI? And she also asks, is ETSI's non-IP the new IP? And I'm going to stop there, and over to you, Teresa.
Thank you, Katarina, because we have just a few minutes left. So this is excellent. Boris's question on standards and the clash between the logics of electronics, semantics, please.
Well, I understood that this was really a comment and not a question. But yeah, I fully agree. We do have the difference between the two different notions, and this of course does not somehow facilitate afterwards standardization efforts. But in general, and this leads me then over to the next question, as a law professor, I can try to understand technical standards as I try to understand what is blockchain, because I cannot write about blockchain if I do not have knowledge about technical infrastructure, but I'm not really a specialist. So eventually specific questions would have to be asked to an engineer.
Thank you for that.
Please go ahead.
No. Thank you for that. Also for stressing kind of the need that even for those of us working on policy, we do need to understand how things work, at least on some basic level. Let's get to even more specific questions from Mrs. Dimova on China and Germany and polymorphic networks.
Well, frankly speaking, I cannot give a precise answer to that. I'm not familiar with the details of the discussions between China and Germany. I have some vague information. I can only say in general terms that as far as infrastructure is concerned, all of us, we know the very quite traditional transport control protocol, the TCP, used for the internet. And we are also aware of the fact that somehow this technical infrastructure will have to be replaced over time. And we have now many initiatives, and including polymorphic approaches. And finally, either the globe will adopt in different regions different networks, then we do have fragmentation, or somehow we can come to terms and make a decision for one specific new network, as it has been decided some 40 years ago with the TCP.
Thank you for that. As we are really approaching the last few minutes of our time, allow me one more question on how it was to work on the book. How long did it take you? That would be my interest to know, to write it.
Of course, I could not devote 100% of my time to writing the book, but since I'm working in the internet governance field now for almost 20 years, starting with the first book, which I published shortly before the first visit, 2003, in Geneva. I had, of course, collected most of the materials, and I was following up what is going on, and I published also in parallel on cyber stability, cybersecurity issues, etc. I would guess it took me 3-4 months, not more.
That's quite a speedy work, but as you explained, it's also based on many years of work before that. So at this moment, I would really like to thank you for coming from Zurich to Geneva to talk to us about your book. Thank you once more.
Thank you for having the chance to present the book here. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And just a few last points, what you can more expect from the Geneva Internet Platform and Diplo in the next 2 days, actually, because the agenda is quite full. Tomorrow, if you're interested, we are organizing a UN kind of Geneva tour on data. So you will be able to dig deeper into what Geneva institutions are dedicated to the question of data. We are also having another masterclass on diplomacy with Diplo's director, Jovan Kurbalia, in the afternoon. And on Friday, and that is kind of hot news from the press, we will organize a little debrief after the last week's summit in Geneva of Presidents Biden and Putin, concentrated on the issue of cyber detente and whether there is some kind of progress in relationship of these two countries after the summit. I would like to thank you for your attention. Yes, Professor.
I just would like to make one final remark. I'm, of course, available for any questions of any attendees. You just use my mail address at the University of Zurich, which you can easily find.
Excellent. Or get in touch with us and we will share Professor Rolf's contact details. Thank you very much for being with us for these 45 minutes and have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.